Well, what the heck am I up to now? This is the back of the ignition switch. It is held in by this little snap ring, which I shall show you. And it's just held into the back of that, of the back of the ignition module, the ignition key tumbler assembly. And that's the whole deal. Well, anyway, why am I in here? Because I'm going to make sure that these contacts are in as pristine shape as possible. I'm actually going to bend these little contact points right here so that they make the most pristine contact possible, so there's no ignition voltage drop. Took a bit of courage to go in here. I think it goes back in this orientation. Oh gosh, I hope it goes back in. Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. All right. Later. Well, what am I up to these days on this beautiful May morning? Well, I've been digging into the SPICA system and been working on it for a number of days. The SPICA system is it's more intimidating than it is complex in terms of, I think, how you work in it. But there's a lot of documentation on the proper procedure to use. So documentation can be found pretty readily on most of the common websites, as well as getting original documentation from Alfa Romeo. But basically what you do is right under this is the thermostatic actuator, and thermostatic actuator is a temperature-driven device that operates as a choke, and it also sets the fuel delivery curve for the engine itself. And basically, the pump sets the amount of fuel, and the butterflies over here, I should say the throttles, are controlled by these levers. And there's a procedure to make sure that these, oh, by the way, one thing about the throttles and the air, all of the air on a SPICA system is controlled through this little distribution mechanism, if you want to call it that. And so in other words, at idle, well, I shouldn't say even at idle, but all of the air is distributed through this little device here. So when the car is running, if you were to put your hand over here at idle, you won't be, your hand should not be drawn into any vacuum. So it's important to make sure that these throttles close properly, which is controlled. Actually, I borrowed this little tool from my friend, and there's an Alfa Romeo tool that sets this adjustment of the throttle stop and the short rod to make sure that you have those throttles closed at when the car is sitting. And anyway, so I've been working on trying to tune the engine, and I must say that it's been a little bit of a hit or miss proposition. It gets good, then it gets worse, then it gets good, then it gets worse. But I think I'm coming closer. I mean, the car, I can get the car up and running, and it runs and idles beautifully, but the fuel delivery, as measured by the gap down here, I don't know if you can see this that well. I'll move my light. Right down there, of course we have a wire in the way, but right down there is where this long rod meets the crank lever. This is adjusting, I'm moving the lever, and this is changing the amount of fuel that the car is getting. When the car is warmed up, the gap between this lever and this reference screw should be very small. It's actually 19 thousandths of an inch when and it's a very critical measurement to make. So I've been trying to do that, and I've been occasionally starting the car up and measuring that gap, and I can't get it to within spec. So there's been a number of fits and starts around that. But anyway, this morning I wanted the car to be completely cold. I made a couple of adjustments. I'm going to try to start it up and see if it'll actually start up and idle. The distributor is set. I think there's the ignition is very retarded, so I think I'm going to have to adjust that somewhat. Actually, I have my setup here. This is my old school engine analyzer. It has a number of functions that you can see here. It's actually a very useful little tool. And I have it all set up. These are the inductive pickups. This is for my timing light, which is over there, and this is for measuring the RPM here. It is very, very accurate, and I get very good signals from the engine, so I think I'm actually measuring the RPM very accurately, which was not the case with one of my other Alfas. It just would not record properly. So anyway, what I'm going to do this morning is get the engine up and running and see how it idles. It's supposed to idle up to about 2,000 RPMs and then slowly come down. Maybe not even 2,000 RPMs, but certainly around the 1,500 to 2,000 range, and then slowly come down. And that's being operated by the coolant temperature, which this is a coolant sensor, and it's just measuring the coolant temperature off of the intake manifold, the water, or should I say the coolant as it's flowing through the water. It's just measuring the temperature. And this little tube is forcing liquid into the actuator, which has a plunger on the bottom of it. That plunger extends and effectively decreases the amount of distance between that lever as the car warms up gradually. So it's like it's a very effective choke mechanism. So let me get this thing started up and see how it runs, and I'll do a brief video when the car is running and see if it's idling well at all, and then I'll be making adjustments as we go, and maybe I'll show some of the how I'm making the adjustments. I just started it up, and the idle is very low. You can see I'm getting about 600 RPM. This thing should be idling much faster. It's got nice throttle response. But I'm going to look at the timing and see if I can adjust the timing a little bit closer to where it should be. It's a little bit too far retarded. So let me see if that makes a difference. You should do the final adjustments with the car warmed up, but that's going to take a few minutes. I have a little heat gun here, thermal. I'm going to measure the temperature. I'm going to measure the temperature on the top of the radiator. 70.6 so far. Alright. So I got the car up to operating temperature, and you got to work quickly here, but I disconnected the thermostatic actuator, and under the actuator there's a screw down there. And you've got to adjust that screw so that this gap here, which you can't really see, so that gap is 0.019, and that calibrates the delivery of the fuel properly. So let me get working on that and see if I can get this thing back together and running again. Well, I got the gap down, I got the car restarted. That's the throttle response I get, which is pretty good. What I'm thinking though is the car might not start up well at cold start. The ignition is a little bit advanced, but that's not horrible. It seems to be idling very nicely, so I'm gonna declare success. Okay, I think we have success here. There's a couple of adjustments I made, but I got the engine idling at about 725, whatever, which is very nice. Comes off of idle pretty well. The idle is pretty even. Not perfect, but pretty freaking even. So let me go through some of the adjustments and gotchas that got me to this point. All right, let me explain to you in setting up SPICA what helped me. This is Pat Braden's Alfa Romeo Twin Cam Companion. And on page 170, there's a picture here of the thermostatic actuator isolated from the rest of the system. And of course, this is the end that goes in, that senses the temperature from the intake manifold. This is the attaching bulb. It's a bracket that attaches it, and this is the tube. Well, if you'll notice here, in this NB, it says extension L to be measured with load P applied to the pusher. This is 4 kilograms. That's about 9 pounds of pressure. And what I found was that my thermostatic actuator would go to a nominal 29, say 28, 29 millimeters extension. But when you put the load on it, this is simulating the load from the pump. When you simulate the load, it's slightly less. So I had a 29 millimeter actuator with a 2 millimeter shim, which would give me an effective 27, which is what's called for in a 1974 pump. That's a 255/1 pump. Well, anyway, I took out the shim because I think I'm actually getting maybe 26 millimeters or so. So that made a difference, a fairly significant difference. So I got rid of the shim. The other difference is this. This is a feeler gauge that I use to measure the distance between the gap. Let me see if I have a picture here. Well, it's going to be down there somewhere. It's actually, it's the gap between the lever and the reference screw. And I don't know if there's a great picture of it here. Whatever. Here's my point. This is a feeler gauge, and I had to use the narrow end of the feeler gauge to go in and measure the pump gap. This is a 1/2 millimeter drill bit, and the 1/2 millimeter drill bit is a much more accurate measuring device than is this. And the reason is because this can be canted slightly this way or this way, whereas that's a round shape and it's either a go or no go. So in other words, there's much more error. When I use this, I got the most accurate measurements. And between those two tricks, this got my SPICA system running up pretty well. I've had the car running all morning. I'm going to let it cool down for the rest of the day and restart it tomorrow morning to see what kind of behavior I get. But I had a nice 725 RPM idle, so I'm pretty happy with it.